One pioneer woman going west wrote in her diary, "I make quilts as fast as I can to keep my family warm, and as pretty as I can to keep my heart from breaking." Friends would often put together squares to give to someone moving out west because it was easier to take the blocks at a whole quilt, and it took up less space, and it gave the women and the girls something to work on as they went on their way and when they arrived at their destination. It was also a way to be remembered. These were called friendship or album quilts because some of the squares had messages or pictures drawn on them. Now, the Baltimore album quilts, 1846 to 1860, were made by those who had money and time. They were made in squares with elaborate bouquets, cornucopias, wreaths of grapes, cherries, tulips, roses, and buds. They were usually appliqued and embroidered, and they used the best fabrics available and the best threads and the best quilting. Now, quilt patterns, usually called scrap quilts, became common because they had so many pieces, and they took on the names that showed the experiences that people were having, like Kansas Trouble, Goose Tracks, Road to California, Oregon Trail, Album, Wig Rose, and Prairie Rose. The favored colors at that time were green, turkey red with white. I have a book up here open to the Baltimore album quilt, and they were the fanciest ever made. The events in this period that affected commerce and therefore the availability of fabric were the Louisiana Purchase. That doubled the size of the United States and began continental expansion. By the way, again, another Boone Countyan, Silas Dinsmore, helped survey that project. Driving the Indians from their ancestral lands to make more way for pioneers, something we're not really proud of. Establishing forts in Ohio and Missouri for protection for those traveling west. New trails were opened, so was the Erie Canal. A trail to Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri through the Cumberland Gap. And the Oregon Trail, again, a Boone Countyan. The first governor of Oregon was Major John P. Gaines from Boone County. He was appointed by Millard Fillmore, who was then president. And if you haven't read the book From Mastodons to, what's the rest of it? The Millennium, there is a story about Major Gaines, and it's really sad. So I'm not going to tell it tonight. The advent of aniline or synthetic dyes made from coal tar replaced natural dyes, and this was a great improvement because they didn't fade or wander into the next color, and they didn't rot the cloth. The sewing machine was invented by Walter Hunt between 1832 and 1834. Thomas Howe invented and patented another one, but we all know the best known one is Singer. And the reason his is so well known is because he sold his on the installment plan. And he needed to. They cost $125. The railroad crossed the Mississippi. These were all things that affected how cloth came to be used. Now the fourth period, which is a very short one, only 10 years, the Civil War period, 1850 to 1860, produced some of the fanciest, the Baltimore album, and the plainest. These were quilts for the soldiers. And they were made by both Southern and Northern women. The United States Sanitary Commission oversaw the needs of the Union soldiers, and the Confederacy was served by the Soldiers' Aid Societies. These quilts were simply made and quickly tied, and they often had a patriotic symbol or messages on them. Both sides used quilts as fundraisers. When women met in groups to make quilts, it became known as a quilting bee. You think it's because all the time. Or maybe it's because they were so busy. It gave women time not only to work, but to catch up on community news or gossip, as well as a time to compare notes on a variety of subjects. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote in her book, Distant Trumpets, that at the quilting bee, you might learn how to bring up babies, mend a cracked teapot, take grease from a brocade, reconcile absolute decrees with free will, to make 5 yards of cloth serve as 6, and how to put down the Democratic Party. The Civil War had a strong adverse impact on the commerce of both the North and the South. The South could no longer produce the cotton to meet needs, and the North would not buy cotton from the South. They didn't want to provide funds for their war coffers. Southern women used what they had and smuggled supplies from England. Soldiers were known to steal or destroy anything of value from homes, including needles, sewing machines, quilts, silver, food, livestock, and especially horses and firearms. So these were often hidden in a place away from the house because sometimes the homes were destroyed also. The North had lost a lot of its labor force to the Army, and so production was limited there or halted altogether. In 1861, the Great Exhibition took place in London's Crystal Palace. Queen Victoria opened the 990,000 square foot exhibit hall to 14,000 exhibits. The most visited were the self-acting machines, 2 of which were for textiles. There was a flax crushing machine and a jacquard lace machine. And there was always a building for women. And anything that could be sold to women, cloth, needles, pots, pans, would be displayed in that exhibit. Admiral Perry was sent to Japan. Back up. The death of Prince Albert in England, 1861, just 10 years after the opening of the exhibition, and the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln in 1865 brought into vogue mourning cloth, these somber black, dark browns, and grays. Admiral Perry was sent to Japan, again by President Millard Fillmore, for the purpose of opening trade. He went in 1852 and back in 1854, and this opened up to the world Oriental art. People were so enchanted by this new art form that it was seen everywhere, in paintings, in clothing, in textiles, in furniture, architecture, in dishes. Remember your mother's blue Willa dishes? And even in horticulture. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered, now you notice there's some overlapping here, but you have to forgive me. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered free land to those willing to move west and claim it. Now there were 3 stipulations. You had to clear the land and plant a crop so you would have food. You had to build a house, and you had to plant 30 apple trees. And that's where John Chapman, the famous Johnny Appleseed, comes into play. And there is a Johnny Appleseed quilt hanging right outside that back door. I won't tell you how it got there. Just wonder. The next period, the Victorian Era, 1880 to 1910, produced a plethora of embellished quilts. The Crazy Quilt was just one of them. It was made of plain or fancy fabrics and was enhanced with fancy embroidery along the uneven seams. And they added names, dates, birds, flowers, and symbols, as well as fringe or tassels. And I'm going to show you one of those because... Yeah, you just lose your mind when you're along with your microphone. I have some, here we go, gloves here somewhere. Well, if that's all I lose, I've been getting along without it for a long time. This particular one was made by, as you can see, the ladies of Big Bone. Now that was Big Bone Baptist Church. And it was made for Reverend James Kirtley who began at Bulletsburg Church. And later he became a pastor and became one of those circuit preachers who served several different churches. And they made two of these. They made one for him and one for his wife. And I have his wife's also, but it's so worn I didn't bring it. Now you figure out how that happened. His is in good shape. The Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876 was the first official World Fair in the United States. Ulysses S. Grant, President, used it to celebrate the 100th birthday of the Declaration of Independence. And one of the exhibits there was the arm and torch of the Statue of Liberty. They hadn't finished it yet, and they were still trying to raise money to get the thing up and going. Another exhibit was the telephone, typewriter, the dynamo, which was the precursor to electric lights, and Heinz ketchup. Women could find what was new in fashion and fabric in the women's building. The Montgomery Ward catalog in 1872 and the Sears Roebuck catalog in 1887 carried a wide variety of fabrics that were available to women anywhere in the United States because the mail was delivered every week. You could order stripes, paisley prints, plaids, checks, floral prints, small or large designs, and any color imaginable. Plain cloth sacking was used. The arts and crafts movement of that day had influence over textiles also, as well as other household furnishings. Common patterns were log cabin, Clay's Choice, flying geese, Texas Star, and postage stamp. The suffrage movement brought patterns such as Drunkard's Path. The double wedding ring became the most repeated pattern ever in America. And by now, quilting was known as an American art form. Amish quilts were used dark and bright colors, no white, plain only, and were made after 1880. They were and are known for their excellent quilting. Amish patterns were simple like their choice of fabrics: diamond in the square, Jacob's ladder, ocean waves, Amish bars, and Pennsylvania Dutch tulip. By 1890, homemade fabric was no longer used. Shirting and conversation prints were the rage. Now, if you don't know what conversation prints are, they are these little prints that have little dogs and cats and horses and toys and all kinds of interesting things in them. However, the great demand for fabric changed the quality and brought it down. The sixth period was the Depression period, 1920 to 1930. Women and men quilted. In fact, I have a friend here, Betty McDavid, whose father made dozens of quilts because they had time and no money. Printed feed, sugar, and flour sacks provided fabric, and they made or exchanged quilt patterns. Homemade templates were used as well as store-bought ones, and there was a variety of quilting patterns. Women continued making quilts to meet family needs, but one event produced a flood of quilts, 25,000 of them. See, we think we got a big one. At the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago, the Sears National Quilt Contest offered a lot of money in prizes, with $1,000 going to the best quilt. There was a lot of money back then.